A democracy, a republic, a democracy, a republic. Which one is America? So democracy is a broad term that refers to a system of government in which supreme power is vested within the people and exercised by them directly or indirectly. This branches off into two types of democracy: indirect democracies and direct democracies. So a direct democracy is a form of democracy in which the eligible electorate, the people that are allowed to vote, directly votes for policies and laws. The famous example of this is ancient Athens. An indirect democracy is also known as a representative democracy, and this is where elected officials are chosen on behalf of the people in order to vote on those laws and policies. Now, a representative democracy can be further broken down into a liberal or illiberal representative democracy. So a liberal democracy is a representative democracy with a rule of law, protection for individual liberties and rights, and limitations on the power of the elected representatives. An illiberal democracy is a representative democracy that has weak or no rules at all on those elected officials to limit their power so they cannot just rule as they please. So that's democracy. Republics are also a form of government in which the power rests with the public through their representatives who will elect the heads of state. Now, this form of government is in contrast to monarchies, in which a person, the monarch, reigns as head of state for their entire lifetime and often passes that power down to their descendants. Now, a republic can be defined as a constitutional republic when it is constituted by a set of institutions which provide a separation of powers, such as the three forms of government that we have in the United States. Those being the legislative branch, which makes the law, the executive branch, which enforces the law, and the judicial branch, which interprets the law. So with all of that being said, the United States could be said to be both a liberal representative democracy and a constitutional republic. So you can see why there's often a debate that rages on between whether we live in a democracy or we live in a republic. And technically, both sides are correct. Of course, this debate continues to go on as political scientists and scholars observe how our government is being run. As such, the term democratic republic has arisen, which highlights that the terms democracy and republic often feature overlapping concerns. Today, we're going to hear from a few different guests that are going to explain some of these terms more in depth about democracy, about how liberalism plays a role in democracy in the United States, some of the downsides of using democracy within our form of government, and ways that we can actually take better actions as people that are participating in this form of government. But before we get there, if you were enjoying this content, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button. We're going to continue to put out lessons around democracy as we go forward in Democracy Discourse. And I want to make sure that you're getting all of our other great content from our world-class speakers and people that we have coming on to our Democracy Works podcast. So hit the subscribe button, and then let's get to these speakers.
To help us to further understand how the United States functions as a democracy, let's first hear from David Stasavage, the Dean for the Social Sciences and the Julius Silver Professor in NYU's Department of Politics and an affiliated professor in NYU's School of Law.
When people think about democracy today and you ask them, what does democracy mean? Very commonly we'll say elections, free elections, free and fair elections with multiple candidates from multiple political parties. And I want to suggest that that's not a definition of democracy. That's a definition of the contemporary form of democracy that we have. Democracy itself has a sort of deeper meaning about trying to give power to the people. And today, elections are the means by which we try to achieve that. But there have been other means of trying to give power to the people in other societies in the past. Autocracy, I think of as being basically the opposite of democracy, in the sense of it's one person who's ruling without any explicit consent of the governed. And they often do that successfully by ruling through a bureaucracy. That is, rather than relying on members of society to counsel them, say in an assembly or legislature or council, they rule through subordinates who they themselves have chosen and who they pay and remunerate and can hire and fire more or less at will.
But how does liberalism play a role in democracy in the United States? Christopher Beem, Managing Director of the McCourtney Institute for Democracy and Associate Research Professor in the Department of Political Science at Penn State University, is going to break down the difference between liberalism and democracy.
So liberalism is an adjective, right, that describes democracy. Democracy is basically majority rule. It's about everyone having a vote, and it's the procedures by which you make real the idea that the people are the sovereign in that society. And liberalism is a system of government that puts checks on itself and puts limits on its power.
And it preserves individual liberties.
Right, exactly. Although I've argued, and I still would argue, that if you're going to accept democracy and equality in the way the framers do, that same equality is grounded in the idea that we all have these rights.
Yeah.
In any case, there is this notion that liberalism is about rights and diffusion of power. And so anytime you hear anybody talking about democracy, except when you're talking about something like deliberative democracy or something on a very much lower scale, what you're talking about is liberal democracy. We've talked about Hungary on this, program before, and his argument is to create what he calls explicitly an illiberal democracy. So if the majority wants to, curtail or diminish the rights of the press or the rights of minorities, gay people, trans people, whatever, refugees, immigrants, the majority has the power to do that. And we don't have to have these kind of liberal, trappings in order to make it a genuine democracy.
Of course, there are some concerns about the inclusion of liberalism in our democracy. Francis Fukuyama, an American political scientist, political economist, international relations scholar, and author of Liberalism and Its Discontents, is going to help illuminate some of these concerns.
So I think that for many people on the progressive left, the real problem is that liberalism is slow. It works by law. It's very procedural. You have to respect, the rights of all the people, including entrenched interests. And so sometimes it's very hard to change things. And that is very frustrating because liberalism in no society has ever lived up to the full promise, that everybody would be treated equally under the law. That doesn't happen in the United States today, despite, our founding on those principles. And so that's one thing. I think there are other sources of discontent. So a lot of it has to do with economics, liberal societies protect property rights. And for that reason, I think they've been associated with economic growth and prosperity. But beginning in the late 70s and 80s, you had the rise of what's now called neoliberalism, where I think market principles were carried to extremes. And also the state, the role of the government was denigrated. And there was an attempt to roll back the state to a point where you had financial instability because of deregulation. You had the growth of a lot of inequality. And that, I think, led to a lot of populism in the 2010s because people didn't like the world that emerged out of those principles.
And what about liberalism versus federalism? Federalism is a system of government in which the same territory is controlled by two levels of government. Generally, an overarching national government is responsible for broader governance of larger territorial areas, while the smaller subdivisions, states, and cities govern the issues of local concern. Fukuyama is going to help us understand how this type of governance further affects our country.
So with something like fundamental equal rights, rights of citizens, of human beings, you can't have federalism. That was really what the Civil War was all about, because the southern states said, well, we voted for slavery before the Civil War. After the Civil War, they said we voted for segregation, and that should be the dominant principle, and the federal government should leave us alone. And I think that Abraham Lincoln's argument when he was debating this with Stephen Douglas before the Civil War said, no, that's not right. The principle of democracy does not trump the principle that all men are created equal that's contained in the Bill of Rights, and that's the dominant principle. And therefore, the federal government has to, has a right to override states' rights in those cases. And that's really why the 14th Amendment was passed, is to make sure that no state could nullify those basic rights. Now, that's true for something as basic as the right to vote, right to speak, right to believe. There are other things that you don't need that kind of uniformity on. And I think, policing, education, a lot of things vary from one part of the country to another. And they probably ought to, because the conditions in, rural Louisiana are really different from San Francisco or Chicago. So I think, you really have to understand the kind of issue that is being federalized. If it does have to do with, basic rights, then that is something that I think you're going to need to impose, uniformly. But there are other issues of policy that, I think you need some variation.
If we are indeed a representative democracy, what does that mean for citizens such as you or I? What do we do to ensure we are actually represented? Let's hear from David Stasavage and Chris Beem again as they give us some food for thought about our participation in democracy.
I mean, I think it's a system that I didn't come up with it, that people have come up with that has been effective at running a democracy at a larger scale than existed beforehand. But I think it's coming back to that issue of us needing to recognize the potential weaknesses of modern democracy and try to see what we can do to mitigate them. Every adult gets the chance to politically participate today, but we participate in a fairly thin way compared to the way that people would have participated in a village council among the Huron. Our participation is often very sporadic. Most people, if they participate politically at all, it's only by voting every few years. And that's it. And when you have that, you're going to have a risk that people become ultimately disconnected from government and see it as a distant thing and a problem, and not recognize that if you want to maintain this democratic system, it's up to you, the people, to try to do something. It's not up to someone else to try to figure it out.
I quote just a couple of stanzas from Mason and Hughes' poem, Democracy. The few stanzas are, I have as much right as the other fellow to stand on my own 2 feet and own the land. And I think that is about as good a summary as I can make. That a good Democrat recognizes that everybody has those rights. Everyone has an equal standing, just as much as the elephant. But in affirming that right of the other fellow, I'm also affirming my right to stand on my own feet. It strikes me that by saying all of the land, you're claiming not just that it's yours, but that you have something proprietary about it, that you have a role to play in it, that you have, as this person with these rights, a certain sense of responsibilities that come from that. In terms of your behavior, in terms of voting, in terms of engaging in the world and coming to understand what you think and what you believe, and then also, affirming that with people. That's not a bad way to say it. You have just as much right I do to stand on my own 2 feet and own the land. And if you really live up to those lines, then I think you have achieved democratic excellence.
So hopefully this gives you a better look under the hood about what is going on in our form of government. Technically, if you're coming in saying that we are in a republic, you are right. And technically, if you're coming in and saying we're in a democracy, you are also right. But you can leave a comment below. Tell me what you think about this debate. Are we in a democracy? Are we in a republic? And more importantly, head over to our community tab and go ahead and vote in our poll for our next lesson so that we can begin exploring democracy further in depth in our democracy discourse. See you in the next lesson.